At this time, we'd like to ask all of our panelists to please join me here on the stage. And while we're waiting for them, was I right? How many of you guys have some questions and concerns after watching this? Did it make your blood boil? It did for me. I made the mistake of watching it before going to work the other day, and maybe that wasn't such a good idea because some folks might have been saying, what's wrong with black people? What's wrong with Stephan? So we have one more joining us very shortly. Okay. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm glad I see Reverend Clay Calloway in the audience. Sometimes when I get a little heated at work, I have to give him a call, and he talks me off the fence, and then call Dr. Jones, and he tells me to stop being so angry. So they're going to count us down in just a few minutes, and we're going to get started.
Testing.
Ready to go. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're so glad you could be here with us today. As I said earlier, we have assembled a panel of academic heavyweights to help us delve a little deeper into some of the issues and topics that were discussed in the documentary. I'll introduce you to our panel. I've had to shorten their bios because, as I said, these are some heavyweights. We begin with Dr. Ricky Jones, who's Baldwin King Scholar in Residence, Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute at the University of Louisville, author and public scholar on American race, politics, leadership, and male identity. He's also the former chair of Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville. Next, we have Dr. Burns, who will join us very shortly. He's an MLK scholar in residence at Simmons College of Kentucky, a biographer of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To the Mountaintop, Martin Luther King Jr. Mission and the Movement, which made him the winner of the 2005 Wilbur Award, author, consultant, HBO film, and Montgomery bus boycott activist and historian. Next, we have Dr. Jemar Tisby. He's a history scholar in residence at Simmons College of Kentucky, and author of a New York Times best-selling author, The Color of Compromise, reformed theologian, educator, and author who explores race, religion, history, and justice. And then finally, we are honored to have Dr. Erica Whitaker, Associate Director of Baptist Seminary of Kentucky's Institute for Black Church Studies. With that said, how about we begin where the film started and ended by asking our panelists, or maybe a better question would be, why do people ask what's wrong with black people? Why do you think that people ask that question? Dr. Jones, sometimes you ask me what's wrong with me when I call you venting or raging.
I want people to be clear
that I love Stephan Johnson.
I love you too, brother.
And Stephan Johnson is absolutely insane. But his individual insanity is no reflection on the collective of black people. But why do people ask the question? I think Ibram does a great job in the documentary as well as in his film, and many other writers and scholars who have looked at race in this country do a great job of letting you know that this entire country has been worked on very effectively to see black people in a particular light. And that work was absolutely essential because black people had to be dehumanized and placed in that light because nothing else could justify white savagery where black people are concerned. So it's a very simple answer when you get to the core of it. If this is a country that was given to white people by God, white man's destiny, white man's burden, all of these things, then the historical and contemporary treatment of black people, to which there is no end in sight, I might add, has to be justified in some way. So it is a white construct of justification of inhumane treatment of other human beings for their own good from the eyes of their oppressors. And if you say anything in opposition to it, very oddly, then you yourself are the racist, not them.
Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Tisby, you guys want to jump in there?
I'll jump in. I think that question is not explicitly asked so much these days. It's normally complexified specifically by white people. They'll say things like, what's wrong with that area of town, you know, or what's wrong with that school in the West End, or what's wrong with those people. And I think part of the fear is because they automatically assume what's right with white people. And wrongness, it has been equivalated to blackness for centuries, and rightness has been associated with whiteness for centuries. And it actually originated with whiteness before blackness. But in order to have righteous whiteness, you needed to have a bedevilment or the wrongness of blackness. So part of my research is to study what is wrong with whiteness. And most people don't want to go there, particularly white people.
Okay. All right. Dr. Tisby?
To ask what's wrong with black people. There's a lot to that. There is, to add on to what's been said, a psychosocial projection of wrong from the wrongdoer onto the wronged. In other words, there is a nascent subconscious guilt that goes along with buying into the ideology of white supremacy and benefiting from it. And to excuse oneself from that guilt, you place the burden on the people you're oppressing. So then black people become a problem. Welcome, doctor. So then black people become a problem. And when we talk about the race problem, what's often implicit is that the problem rests with black people, whether black people doing something wrong or black people having the burden to fix what's been going wrong. So it's a very provocative question, and I appreciate how the documentary was bookended with it, because even in proposing the question, the very absurdity of it comes to the fore. And it helps us remind us of the absurdity of categorizing people according to skin color, as if that has something deeply to do with their character.
Dr. Burns, thank you so much for joining us. There's your mic right next to you. With that said, you mentioned earlier about saying that neighborhood, those neighborhoods, what's wrong with those neighborhoods? Why is it that on January the 6th, when we saw predominantly white crowds going into the Capitol, with the Confederate flag, which is the banner of disloyalty, black people, I think, were looking and saying, what's wrong with those people? Why is it that the Trump supporters aren't saying the same thing? A lot of us thought that was going to be a wake-up call, but here we are, and he's still leading in the polls on the Republican side.
I think part of that, and I'll echo what Dr. Tisby said, it's the psychology, and I would even argue the theology that's immersed with the ideology of Christian nationalism. So what happened on January 6th in the eyes of the system that's actually working, called white supremacy, is that they were the saviors of the country. And this link between whiteness and salvation is really critical because that allows the imagination of the country to justify what takes place on January 6th as an act of salvation. And we saw that in the documentary, was the white savior complex, even by the white progressive liberals or the white abolitionists, still had this white savior complex that we see in Thomas and Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, even Mark Twain at times. We see this pattern throughout history. So in a sense, it wasn't surprising how the country interpreted January 6th.
How do we get the people in the room? This is probably like preaching to the choir. Dr. Burns, perhaps you could address this. How do we get more people, more white people, I should say, to see documentaries like this and to address these issues?
First of all, I want to apologize for being a little bit late. I am teaching a course at Simmons College, which I'm so fortunate to be able to do.
You have an excuse tardy.
And it's called M.L. King's Lived Theology. And so I was only able to teach the first hour of it, but I got down here as quickly as I possibly could. So could you repeat the question?
Well, I just wanted to know, how do we get more whites to see documentaries or films like this? For instance, I work at WDRB years ago, and I'm glad Reverend Calloway's here. We were sitting in the meeting, and Georgia Davis Power was here at St. Stephen Church. And I was listening, and they said, well, we covered her at the Capitol, so we're not going to cover it. And I thought, man, that doesn't feel right. And so I spoke up. And they said, well, we covered her at the Capitol. We've done a lot of stories. And I called Reverend Calloway. And he said, not only do you all need to cover, this is Georgia Davis Powers. He said, you need to cover it. You need to be here. And I went and told him, somebody I really respect said that I need to be there. And I had to fight for it. And just to keep me from having a temper tantrum, they let me come and cover it. But again, if more whites with manager behind their title saw documentaries like this, maybe they would understand and I wouldn't have to have those fights.
I think as long as so many white people feel victimized, they're going to feel that they're more victimized. Even if they think that black people have been victimized, they're going to think that they were victimized more severely, which of course is not the case. But they need to learn, and again, seeing this powerful documentary is a great way to do it, but they need to realize that while they have been victimized, and I'm talking about lower class, working class white folks, they have been victimized. There's no question about that. I mean, especially over the past 50 years, that the rates of inequality among whites as well as other people in the country have just grown tremendously. So they're so caught up in their own feeling of victimization that they simply are unable to even consider the possibility that someone else might be more victimized than they are, and then they feel mistakenly. But I guess the short answer to your question is white people have got to learn about white affirmative action, because you'd say to most white people, including more educated white people, you talk about white affirmative action, and what the hell are you talking about? White affirmative action. Well, the real affirmative action, as I think all of us probably know, was for white people. And it goes back a very, very long way. I mean, especially, you know, just look at the Civil War, and even during the Civil War, Lincoln was able to pass the Homestead Act, which gave all this free land to white settlers, and black people were excluded from that. And when the war was over and the Freedmen's Bureau was created, the Freedmen's Bureau lasted a very short time. Very, very little land was given to the freed slave people. So white people need to realize that yes, they might have been victimized in certain ways, especially in recent years, but it doesn't compare with. And I was just thinking last night when I was thinking about what I might say today that it'd be great if somebody like the distinguished Jemar Tisby here, or would write a book about how a book for, you know, there are these books called Dear White People and so forth, and a book about how white people have been victimized. So first you start out and you talk about, yes, you know, white people, especially in recent decades have been victimized. I'm talking about lower class, working class white people. But then in the next part of the book, you talk about how black people, African Americans, have been victimized so much more deeply. And then in the third part, you talk about how what needs to be done to remedy that situation, which I think is, you know, we need to have multiracial alliances led by black and brown people. Not that white people wouldn't be leaders too, but that the primary leaders would be black and brown people. It would be democratically led by black and brown people. But that I guess is sort of my answer to begin with.
I would respectfully encourage Brother Tisby not to waste his time writing such a book. I think white people talk enough about their victimization, and it hasn't just been in recent years. They've been talking about their victimization a very, very long time. It is really the root of post-Civil War white supremacy. That's why you see so many Confederate statues and monuments all over this country. They're basically monuments to proclaim white victimization so that you remember what happened to you and do not let it happen again, and you must maintain your place in society. To your original question, what can we do to get more white people to watch films like this or read books or care about blackness, where black people fit into the proclaimed ideals of freedom, justice, equality, liberty for all. All men are created equal. It was a lie from the beginning. White people in mass, let me say this slowly, white people in mass cannot be convinced to help black people one iota. We will always have anomalous white people who are allies, and most of them even are only willing to go so far. That was Frederick Douglass's problem with William Lloyd Garrison. So if you really understand the history of this country, that was Martin Luther King Jr.'s, my dear Morehouse brother. That was his problem with white liberals who were constantly telling black people they needed to wait, be patient, and do things the right way. We still hear those things now, right? So if you really understand the history of this country and black liberation, running back to 1619, there were always black people who resisted. The Negro Convention movement existed in the 19th century, as early as the 1820s and 1830s, where black people are coming together to liberate themselves in the face of other black people who have been so mentally deranged that they were aiding their oppressors in their own oppression. Gabriel Prosser died in 1800 because a loyal black slave told on him and got him and his co-conspirators killed, and all they wanted to do was be free. Denmark Vesey died 22 years later, the same way, because a loyal black slave told. Today in 2023, a friend of mine in education who is looking at Senate Bill 6 and 93 here in the state of Kentucky that attack or even make diversity initiatives in this state illegal from kindergarten to college. He wanted to have a meeting with black folk who are working in education. They were so afraid that they would not attend the meeting. And one of his white colleagues said to him, "I hear you're trying to organize a meeting. Is that true?" A black slave today told. So if black people who are really concerned about their true freedom are concerning themselves with convincing a majority or a decent percentage of white people to pay attention to the work of Ibram or the work of Brother Tisby or my work or anybody else's who's really concerned about black liberation, you are wasting your time. That is a fool's errand. That is not how white supremacy works.
You quoted Thomas Jefferson. He wrote, all men are created equal. Do you think he knew what he was saying? And if so, does that mean one of our most celebrated founding fathers was nothing more than a hypocrite?
I'll say it very briefly so we can go to other panelists. Mm-hmm. Thomas Jefferson was being just as honest when he said all men are created equal as Donald Trump was being when he said, "I have done more for black people than anybody except maybe Abraham Lincoln." And Abraham Lincoln himself didn't think that black people should remain in this country once we were emancipated. He felt the ideal solution for black people was to deport us in the same way that the American Colonization Society thought they should. And we still celebrate Abraham Lincoln. So if you believe Thomas Jefferson, you're a fool. If you believe Abraham Lincoln loved the black people and was the great emancipator sent to us by God, you're a fool. And if you believe that the Democrats or the Republicans are on your side, you're a fool. And if you believe that you can convince white people en masse to even sit down and watch a 90-minute film and denounce white supremacy and help you be truly free and empowered, I say you're a fool.
Dr. Kwanzaa Kunjuku, who used to come to St. Stephen, said that Abraham Lincoln fired the slaves. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Prince.
Sorry, I thought the film actually was a little easy on Jefferson. Didn't say anything, unless I misheard it. Didn't say anything about his philosophy of I don't think he called it scientific racism, but basically he was the originator of so-called scientific racism, which was very, 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 very influential. And so I thought that film could have come down a little harder on. I mean, because there's nothing to redeem Thomas Jefferson. And as to your question, no, he wasn't thinking about black people being created equal. No, he that wouldn't be in his consciousness. That wasn't what he thought about when he thought about all men. Just of course he didn't think about all women either, but he wasn't thinking about anybody except white men.
So as the sister said, he was he was a contemptible hypocrite. You're in church. All right, okay. Right. So I did, yeah. With that said, what about diversity? After George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, a lot of companies have been talking about diversity and hiring more people of color, but can you guys address why, Dr. Jones is laughing, can you guys address why it's not enough? Just like, for instance, people will say to me, like, man, WDRB looks like BET sometimes, but I always have to tell them, and my wife is here, she knows that I get in trouble at work a lot, but I always have to remind them that the people who make the decisions in the offices, those people don't look like us. So keep that in mind. And so what do we do to change that? Or when they do get somebody, in the words of one of the greatest theologians of all time, Dr. Ricky Jones, they get a safe Negro. somebody who's not going to tell them that we should cover the funeral of a civil rights icon or when there are other issues.
I use stronger words than safe Negro when you and I are away from
Right.
church drinking bourbon, but yeah, that'll work, safe Negro.
Yeah, but how do we do that? Why? Because sometimes people think that when you get black and brown faces in companies that it's okay, they've checked the diversity box, but it's not enough because we don't have any decision-making power.
Go ahead, Jemar. Build black institutions.
Like Simmons College of Kentucky?
Like Simmons College of Kentucky, like St. Stephen Church, like historically black denominations, historically black fraternities and sororities. These are the sites of black empowerment and independence. I wrote an article about the resignation of Dr. Claudine Gay, the first black and first black female president of Harvard University, also the shortest tenured president in the 400-year history of Harvard University. And there was a lot that went into that, but one wonders what it would have been like had she taken her prodigious talents and skills to a historically black institution. That's just one example. The point being, in a lot of these institutions, I heard this from a preacher, say you're baking a cake from scratch, you put in the flour and the eggs and whatever else goes in there, you mix it up, you put it in the oven, you take it out, and then you taste it and you realize, I forgot the sugar. Now your solution is to grab a little bit of sugar and sprinkle it on top, as if that will fix the problem. Many of these institutions were mixed up, put in the oven, and baked without the sugar. And to fix the problem, they're trying to sprinkle diversity on top of the cake. But you can't do that after the fact. It's got to be incorporated into the batter. And so aside from starting black institutions, there could perhaps be a small window to start intentionally multiracial institutions. That in itself comes with its own internal power struggles. But I don't have a whole lot of confidence that historically white, well-moneyed, older institutions will significantly change to allow a sharing of power with black people, women, and others.
Here's why I laughed. Because in 2020, and you all remember, there was basically a triumvirate of murders. Ahmaud Arbery down in my home state of Georgia, Breonna Taylor here, and then George Floyd. And then we tumble into COVID, and then happened what I call the summer of black love. You had all these white companies and all these white schools. The plantation where I've worked for the last 27 years, the University of Louisville, was among them, that sent out these statements. We didn't know it was this bad. We see you, we understand now. We must do better, we can be better, and we will. If you believe them, you are a fool. Immediately after, you've never seen in recent memory more blatant attacks on black people, right? And you got to understand what this DEI thing is anyway. DEI is a trick. DEI is a renaming, a rebranding. What it's really coming from is affirmative action. And affirmative action was put in place in the 60s, tumbling into the 70s, ironically under Richard Nixon, right, when it gets encoded into the law. But it was targeting black people, and white America was pissed about it. And so folks then started to call things diversity. They wanted to hide programs that were targeting black people under the banner diversity. So in the 80s, you get this multicultural movement, right? In the 70s, you look around college campuses, you had all these powerful, black studies departments were getting started, and you had black cultural centers on these campuses. University of Louisville had a black cultural center. Then they changed the name to the Multicultural Center. Now it's just the Cultural Center. By next week, it might just be a center. Who knows? Right? Who knows? But what folks did with DEI when it got popularized during the Summer of Love is they tried to sprinkle. First of all, I don't think they really wanted to change anything, Jemar. I think that it was another distraction and deception. One or two things happens with most of these DEI positions, and people leave them very, very quickly for the most part. They would either have a BS milquetoast soft Negro who is absolutely not going to rock the boat at all, who is used as an institutional pacifier, who is much more concerned with individual position than he or she is with collective power. And they will stand them up in front of everybody and say, see, we celebrate diversity. And when you really get to the heart of it and you sit down and talk to that person, as my grandmama used to say, they won't fight the flies out of their face. Unfortunately, because black people have been so worked on and miseducated so effectively, we are still enamored with black faces in high places. So Dr. Thingamajigget and Associate Provost Thingamajig will come in and tell you that he or she has this position, and we'll have a celebration of them. And they are not your friend. White power structures will keep them in place as long as possible because they ain't gonna do anything. Now, flip it. You might get a very capable and dedicated diversity officer who goes in, but these institutions aren't really dedicated to change, and whenever he or she tries to make some changes, they are going to strip them of budget. They're going to make them an office of one. They are going to persecute them relentlessly, and they are going to leave within 2 or 3 years because they will get broken down and spiritually shattered. That's what you're going to get. Also, what you get in these DEI positions, if you are a person like me who is concerned about black struggle, right? The antagonization of black men, women, and our children, what DEI does is a white supremacist paradigm. It lumps everybody who isn't white under one umbrella. And see, this is what diversity is all about. And just like affirmative action, even though they'll put a black face on it, the single group that benefited the most from affirmative action over the years wasn't black people at all. It was white women. But when the fight starts, the white women are absent, strangely. Like a white woman asked me a few years ago, when the Mad King Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, and she said to me, Dr. Jones, why did people abandon Hillary Clinton? And why did women abandon Hillary Clinton? I was like, oh, you asked the wrong question. Black women voted for Hillary Clinton, as they do in every election, by more than 95%. Black women are the Democratic Party's most loyal constituency. I don't know how much it's got us, but they are. The second most loyal constituency to the Democratic Party, black men. More than half of white women voted for Donald Trump. And then folks will turn and say, what happened? So the question wasn't why did black people or black women abandon Hillary Clinton? The question was, why did white women abandon Hillary Clinton? That's a question for white women to answer, not for us. We're wasting our time with all of that. So we'll get to it, because you were in a very powerful documentary. And you're trying to be nice to folks, Jemar, where my fraternity brother Charles Blow asked, maybe, because every time black people stand up and say, hey, something is wrong here, white people say, if you don't love it, leave it. And Charles Blow said, maybe it's time for us to leave. Not the country necessarily, but we'll get to that a little bit later.
So basically what you're saying is that Donald Trump deserves credit for getting black people to vote.
No,
I
know you're joking. I'm not saying that Donald Trump deserves credit for getting black people to vote, because people keep saying this is about Donald Trump anyway, man. Donald Trump hijacked the Republican Party. No, he didn't. Donald Trump is the logical end of the Republican Party's ideology that's been pushing since Strom Thurmond and others in the 1940s, all the way up to Barry Goldwater.
He's their Frankenstein
and Ronald
monster.
Reagan and others. He ain't that Frankenstein monster. He is Dr. Frankenstein.
He's Dr. Frankenstein.
So don't believe that. Nikki Haley just got on TV and said America is not a racist country and never has been. Y'all think I'm lying? Get out there and check it out.
Could I say a word about DEI?
Sure.
DEI, it doesn't have to do with diversity, and it doesn't have to do with inclusion, but what it really doesn't have to do with is equity. It's the equity part of it, and of course the way King talked about, when he talked about integration, and when he talked about equity, it was equal power. It was always equal power. And you can't have equity without equal power. I mean, it means nothing in these situations. And I was at an elite university where in the 90s and 90s when we had our early versions of DEI and multiculturalism and so forth, and the heads of the heads of the campus, there was the Black Center, and there was the Chicano Latino Center, and there was the Native American Center, and so forth. And they struggled for pennies, to keep those centers open. And those centers could do very little. And they were always looking behind them to see if the powers that be would crack down, if they just did something. If, for instance, I was there when the uprising happened in L.A. In 1992, and there was real concern by the the leader, the good people, the leader of the Stanford Black Center, whatever it was called. They felt so restrained, that they could not openly support. All the students were, organizing on their own. They couldn't even lead. They couldn't even lead or provide important resources for the black students who wanted to support what was going on in LA. And so it's the equity part of it, and even the word equity, they call it equity, not equality, but equity. That word itself doesn't really mean what we mean by equality. So it's the power question, which I think everybody's been kind of referring to, that without power, and with Claudine Gay, she was my student, she was my star student, and we were good friends, and I've been devastated by what happened with her, and it was a vendetta. It was a well-organized campaign, highly organized campaign by Christopher Dufo, who's the, if that's his name, who's the Rufo, who's one of the leading neo-fascists around, and some of you may know, and I still can't quite believe that he did this openly, but when it was all over and Claudine she was fired, he sent out a tweet, all in caps, scalped. This is what white settlers did to Native Americans and others, and black people in different ways. Scalped. I mean, how open about fascism can you be? So anyway, enough about it.
Can I add something, particularly about white women? Dr. Tisby last. White women are one of the best visualizations of whiteness. And white spaces, especially those that are designed specifically to try to be more diverse by including as many non-white entities in the room as possible, are just perpetuating this image of the Virgin Mary. So the Virgin Mary is one of the first visualizations of whiteness, and she is pure, she is clean, she is perfect, she is without fault, and she is without controversy. And white spaces like DEI, or DUI, whatever you want to call it, DUI, design yourself, basically image of whiteness, are designed to be without controversy. And so anytime you have spaces that are gathered together that don't actually address the issue, those are white spaces, even if black and brown faces are being filled in those spaces. And white women have used historically created spaces in order to promote this myth of equality around power when it's only benefited them and their own whiteness. And whiteness itself is unattainable. And we see this in the film industry. And I really liked what they did in the documentary around the whiteness of film and photography. How the visualization of whiteness is often seen and purified in the white woman, specifically with what was taking place in King Kong. So this pure white woman, and white women can't even be purely white, although they try. Then it's contrasted with this King Kong gorilla-like figure. Now, the film industry, in its inception, even designed lighting, lenses, all of those mechanics to illuminate whiteness, white skin color. And even white women in the days of black and white had to become whiter in order to actually attain whiteness itself. Even in films like Blade, if you see the, what's his name? Wesley Snipes, he is contrasted differently than all the white figures. It's hard to make him out in some scenes because film itself is just designed to illuminate white skin. And so the visualization of whiteness is that distorted imagination that Willing Jennings talks about. It's the meaning making of what we do with the visuals. And white liberals, particularly white liberal women, have, interesting enough, tried to add skin color back into the dialogue around how can we remove whiteness, when whiteness actually should never be correlated with skin color, like blackness should never be correlated with skin color or skin features. That in and of itself, I think, is the crux of the issue.
All right. Well, it sounds like what Reverend Jones said earlier is that sometimes when we fill these positions, DEI positions, that we celebrate, but really it can do more harm than good, especially if you have the wrong person in that position. Could any of you guys address that? Why that's harmful, or is that harmful?
I think probably even the most important thing you said about DEI, and I would love for you to elaborate if you allow me to ask a question, is lumping in all forms of diversity into the DEI bucket. Will you unpack that a little bit?
Go ahead, Reverend Jones.
Well, it confuses people, right? I mean, so it's like our struggle. That's why I hate the term people of color. I just don't like it. So I'm in sympathy with my Hispanic brothers and sisters, but our struggles are not the same.
Right.
I'm in sympathy with the sexism that white women have endured and still endure, but our struggles are not the same. The struggles of black women and white women are not the same. That's why the whole study of womanism in response to feminism was created, because white women were constantly cutting black women out, right? I mean, I'm in sympathy with our Asian brothers and sisters, but our struggles are not the same. And in some cases, I'm even in sympathy with our continental African brothers and sisters, but our struggles are not the same. We don't see the world in the same way. And that's not just coming from white people. Frantz Fanon wrote about that. There is something to be said for national boundaries that we have to understand that make things a whole lot more complex. That's why some of the work of ADOS is very, very interesting, and people should dive into it more deeply. And so when you have this very lazy, elementary DEI thing going on, it basically becomes an inch deep, right, and a mile wide. But it has no depth to it. And if you are a person who understands, and look, again, I'm in sympathy with my Jewish brothers and sisters when you talk about the Holocaust. It happened. That's a serious thing. And one of my Jewish brothers told me about the Jewish Seder. And he said, no less than 5 times in that ritual, every Jewish man and woman, and they teach it to their children, and I respect it. They say, never forget that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And he was real clear with me. He was like, look, Ricky, we don't say your ancestors were slaves. We say you, right? So it is a historical link, right? A psychological and spiritual link to their past. And I said, you know, black people need to have a ceremony where we say, never forget that you were a slave in this land, and still are. People start talking about, I don't want to play Oppression Olympics. I ain't got to play Oppression Olympics with you. No race of people has suffered as much in this country because of the skin that God gave them than black people. Period. Period. Maybe, with the exception of the Native American brothers and sisters who white people basically just killed off from the beginning. But when you look longitudinally, black suffering is at the heart of it. And I'll go back to a real world example, what they call the VP for diversity now at the University of Louisville, which they just changed it, by the way. It's now the vice president for equity or something like that. Why? Because they were so afraid as politicians in this state and in this country were attacking diversity, they thought if they changed the name, they'd leave them alone. Other campuses, they're starting to call them VPs for inclusion or belonging and that type of silliness. It's like, you know, your oppressor is not smart enough to know that you're trying to do the same thing with a different name because you ain't really trying to do anything anyway. But I know about that position. I know what that position is about. Why? Because I wrote the job description for it. Me and my friend Eddie Warner, who is now away from the university, over 2 decades ago, we led the campus movement that created it. When the person that we initially hired, Dr. Maureen Taylor Archer, got ready to retire, I went to the president, who at the time was Neely Bendapudi, and her chief of staff, and said, I don't want this job permanently, but I will do it for a minute while we conduct a national search and find somebody that I think can do it right. I was told, we can't give you this job because the word on you is that you only care about black people, and that's not what this position is about. And I said, brother, you don't have to tell me what the hell this position is about. I know what it's about because I wrote it. And what's happening right now, you're trying to de-emphasize black people. And I don't appreciate it. The problem with Kentucky, though, good reverend, and we talk about it all the time, is that we ain't got enough black people here who are tough enough, who are mean enough, who are hard enough, who mad enough and smart enough and committed enough to fight these people off of them when they do something like that. They think we're an easy kill. And right now, they're right.
Let me ask you this, and I hate to pick on you, but you're the person that I've, my sounding board.
Man, I'm trying to stop. I don't want to talk too much. Let them talk.
So I just want to ask you another thing about, or anybody can answer this. We look at things from a different perspective. When Muhammad Ali died, it was one of the times you had to talk me off the fence. Remember, you told me, you said, man, go home and eat dinner with your wife and son. Because when Muhammad Ali died, I thought that's a no-brainer. I mean, this is a national icon, right? Well, there were people calling our newsroom nonstop, calling him a coward, and I was trying to argue with them and say, but if he had gone to the service, you know, he wouldn't have had to go fight. I mean, he could have done exhibitions and stuff like that. This wasn't a cowardice thing. This was something he had to stand up. If not him, then who? He had to stand up for other blacks. He gave up a lot. He gave up his prime. Remember, I called you complaining, and you said, man, go home. It was like trying to cut a football field with scissors, a pair of scissors, the grass or something. I mean, I was on the phone. I get one of them taken care of. Then another phone call would come in.
He's getting upset.
Right. And then another one would come. So why is it that we look at that or we see that from two different perspectives? Because there are still people to this day who say he was a draft dodger.
I want to keep this short, Stephan, and I do remember that. And I told you to go home with your wife because you have a beautiful wife who's very, very smart, who is very, very kind, who is well accomplished. I don't know how she got with you. I've never figured it out. She is a great,
Like all
great
men
woman.
I married up.
Yeah, you
So
married
move
her.
on.
She's a great woman. I envy you. She's been with you for I don't know how long. How long you been married now?
21 years.
21 years. I can't get a woman to stay with me for 21 days. And so I
Because
told
you're
you
crazy.
to go home to your wife. But look, man, this isn't about Ali. Let me say this very, very quickly, okay? And then I'm just going to shut up because I don't want to dominate this conversation. All of this, a lot of that stuff, Ali, all this other stuff, the Summer of Love back in 2020, DEI, it's all a distraction. All of this stuff really boils down to three things for me. Asking myself three questions my whole adult life, and I didn't understand exactly what I was doing, but I understand it now. Three things. One, and this film talks about this a bit. First question is, how was white supremacy and anti-black racism created specifically in this country? That's the first question. How were they created? And they go hand in hand. And by white supremacy, I mean white people thinking they and only they are the ones who have the right to think, know, and decide. To think about what the problems are in this country, what needs to be done, to know what the right thing to do is, and to decide, right, to have the power to do it. That's what power is, to make something come into being even though somebody opposes you. So one, how were white supremacy and anti-black racism established? Two, how were they spread, reaffirmed, and concretized, right? How did it get baked into the system then, right? And so the face of it will change, but the end result is the same. You can call it slavery, you can call it segregation, you can call it anti-CRT, anti-DEI. It's all the same. It's all about maintaining white supremacy in a system, right? And then the third question is, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? As a scholar, as a political philosopher, I've really seen three options that have been presented to me. One, integration. You tell me, and I started off as a staunch integrationist, just like King. Look at King towards the end of his life, though. If you actually study him, he starts leaning away from it. Many others do as well. Du Bois did, Robeson did. This system broke them to the point that Du Bois sent a letter to a friend of his before he left this country in '61 and said, Negroes in America cannot win. That was Du Bois. So integration is first. You let me know how that's working out for us. The second one is fundamental nationalism. From Garvey, Henry McNeill Turner, Martin Delany, they agree with Abraham Lincoln, in effect, saying that black people needed to leave here. Some say go back to Africa, others go to the Caribbean, go somewhere, go to Haiti, go wherever, but not here. Go somewhere where you have a substantial percentage of black people. The third option was basically neo-black nationalism, with groups like the Nation of Islam, who said, look, black people do not want to leave this country en masse, black Americans though. We deserve to stay here. We've put just as much into this country as anybody else. In fact, I shudder to think where the country would be when you start talking about freedom, justice, and equality. If not for black people, we've been the conscience of this country. So what this country should do to repair some of this in reparations is to give us land, give us states where we can go and, in effect, establish a country within a country. America ain't gonna give us no land. But there's a modification on the table now, and if you have not read Brother Charles Blow's book, The Devil You Know, that came out a few years ago, and if you don't want to read, I understand everybody got to make their TikToks and get on their Instagrams and go party. If you don't want to read the whole book, go watch the HBO documentary South to Black Power, which Brother Tisby is a part of. You did a fabulous job, by the way, too. I was sitting there drinking, and I was like, I know that Negro. He looked good. Charles Blow is saying this. There are a number of states in this country that already have significant percentages of black people. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland. Did I say Mississippi? Yes, sir. Okay. anywhere from 23 to 38% black. Blow's argument is like, look, why are you still fighting in places like Kentucky or Wisconsin or Oregon? The white people are telling you they don't want you here. They don't want your children in their schools. And if they are in their schools, they don't want to teach them anything about themselves. As Carter G. Woodson said, they want to twist their minds. And you wonder why these people are paying so much attention to education. It is the ultimate socialization agent.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Teachers put their fingers on children more than anybody other than those children's parents. So it ain't just who's teaching them. We are worried about the wrong thing. We want more black teachers. No, I'm worried about what's being taught. Last time I checked, Daniel Cameron's black. Clarence Thomas is black. You get some people, black teachers like that in a room, what you think they're gonna teach your children? So Blow is like, stop fighting in a place like Kentucky, which Kentucky is doing better. Last year, Kentucky was the 7th whitest state in the nation. At the beginning of 2024, as the numbers have been run again, Kentucky is now the 8th whitest state in the nation. It has changed places with Oregon. So Blow is like, look, leave. Go to states that already have an appreciable percentage of black people. You can seize the state legislatures in those states where they cannot persecute black cities like Charlotte or Atlanta or Jackson or Birmingham. It seems to me that that is a very pragmatic thing to do.
But wouldn't those states, wouldn't that area be imperialized by the dominant America?
Well, this is a question that America might just bomb us if we move, but at least it's a change. And technically, we still be a part of America. It'd just be predominantly black. Have y'all been to Atlanta? Imagine that as a state. I'm just putting it out. It's not my idea, it's Charles Blow's. South to Black Power. Go watch it tonight just to see Brother Tisby. Okay?
Dr. Michael Eric Dyson quotes Gore Vidal and saying the United States of amnesia. It said that America is obsessed with history and reenactments when it's some war that was lost, but when it's black history, the narrative is much different. Dr. Whitaker, you were going to say something earlier?
Yeah, so you mentioned black suffering, and historically what took place specifically around black suffering after the Civil War is that whites really stole black suffering and took it into white suffering. And we see that with the visualization of white Jesus and the shift in which Jesus even took different forms to align with the cause of the Confederacy, but then with the KKK as well. I'm curious to know your thoughts because right after the Civil War Reconstruction, we did see this massive black power progression. And then we saw this huge white backlash. And we see these patterns, and maybe Dr. Tisby, since I get to co-teach with you, can speak into this. And it was mentioned in the documentary too. What happens and what happens over and over again, even if black people got their own state. I mean, good luck. Texas, you can take Texas. No.
Texas is lost. That's over. Yeah, that's over.
So we're talking, I think, about white backlash or white lash, as it's sometimes called. Anytime there is a hint of black progress in the nation, there is a not equal response, a disproportionately negative response. And you know, to me, it's significant that it doesn't work out neatly, black progress, then the backlash. There is backlash amid any attempt to progress. So the KKK was formed during Reconstruction. It wasn't after Reconstruction. It was already going at the beginning of Reconstruction. So black people emancipated immediately white people organizing to re-enshrine white supremacy, right? So it's happening concurrently. And we can always expect that. That's been a truism throughout history. But to me, and this is like the theological, spiritual side we in church, what's not remarkable, I wrote in my first book, racism never goes away, it adapts. That's actually not remarkable to me. If you want to look at it spiritually, because sin never goes away. Murdering has never gone away. Thieving has never gone away. Adultery has never gone away. Whatever you want to call it. Racism is not going away, but it will change forms from race-based chattel slavery to Jim Crow segregation to racialization nowadays. That we should expect. What is utterly incomprehensible to me is that amid all of the racist adaptations, there are always a people willing to rise up and resist. We have never been defeated because we have never quit fighting racism. And so now we're in a phase where we're trying to figure out, amid the adaptations that racism has made in the 21st century, what are the best tactics to do it. But we're still working toward strategies, progress, equality, and dignity. And that is the truly incomprehensible part. We can talk all day about the problems, and we got to know what the problem is before we can move towards solutions. But I want us never to forget our power. My Lord, we saw what we faced, and we are still here. We are the people who never quit, never quitting. And that's what's remarkable.
Amen. So how do we, as we wrap things up, how do we get more, because for change to happen, quite frankly, more white people have to be in the room, and we have to get more John Browns who say that I have a system to destroy and no time to waste. Right. Yeah. So how do we get more white people to understand that the playing field is not even?
What I often tell white people is you either join the fight or get out of the way. And most white people are ambivalent. Like whiteness itself is ambiguous. And to stand in the middle, moderate, progressive-ish, you don't want to rattle the boat. You're actually in the way.
Well, if you get out of the way, though, isn't that tantamount to agreement?
Oh, sure. That's fine. Like, you're totally complicit, for sure. But you standing there is not helping. You creating an organization that's run by white people that you're trying to solve racism is actually not helping. You need to be sending money to black institutions, like Simmons College. All right? You need to be supporting and fighting alongside, not over top. And the thing about whiteness is that it's created to be invisible, ever evolving. And so it's going to play tricks on how you see things. And it's going to lie to you over and over again to convince you that you're on the right side. And the only time that you think you're on the right side is when you are actually oblivious to your own internal racism. And if you can keep that in check, and by you, I mean white people like me, to be like, oh, I still carry the error, the psychological generational effects of white supremacy that's been passed on for a generation, just like the victimization of black people that's been passed on generationally, that has still been part of me. And so you have to say, I'm not going to get it right all the time, but I'm going to keep fighting. And I'm going to trust that there are going to be people around me who are going to be like, you're getting it wrong. And I have to see the invisible power of whiteness that is still lying to me. That's what I would offer white people.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, I'd say, as Stokely Carmichael said many times, that integration needs to be a two-way street. Actually, that's not quite the right metaphor. But really, it's time for white people to integrate into the black world, and in terms of their soul, get spiritual, what they're missing by not being part of the black world and all the history, all the tradition of resistance, all the ways that black people have struggled and overcome, their souls are really suffering, if anyone cares. But that, I think, is part of it, is just to get more white people to be involved in black-led institutions and be willing to accept, not to really believe in why black leadership is so important, not just as a token thing or just a window dressing, but to really understand why, if you look at the history of black leaders in this country, black men and black women, the leadership, I mean, King, of course, is up there, but there are so many others, as you've mentioned. So really, it's being willing, not accepting black leadership in a kind of a sort of way of I can't think of quite what the expression is I'm trying to use, but to really see the value of and what difference it makes, and just looking at the Black Freedom Movement, or going back, four centuries or longer, the quality of black leadership. There's very little in white leadership that even comes close to that. So that's part of it. That the white people, if only somehow white people could realize that they could really learn so much. I certainly have. Even tonight, I've learned from Reverend Joan. Very happy to be able to learn from you, as I always learn from Jamil. They're missing out. I mean, they're missing out, and they, somehow we have to celebrate Dr. King, but we also have to celebrate, Bob Moses and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and so many other extraordinary black leaders.
I'll say something real quick, because I have worked with a lot of white folk, and particularly white evangelicals. And I always recommend three things. First, that you preach to yourself, and then if you want to talk to other white people and save us some stress and time, three things. Number one, understand your conversion story. So the white people in this room, you're in this room for a reason. There's something that happened in your life. There's a conversation you had, a relationship you had, a book you read, a place you visited. The light bulb came on, and you said, this is something I, as a white person who benefits from the status quo, need to be part of changing. You need to know that story backwards and forwards and be able to recite it just like a testimony. Why? Because number one, when you explore that experience for yourself, you'll gain more riches and a deeper understanding of what it is that transformed you. Then you'll be able to tell other white people about it. And why I say to start there, it's easy to argue or disagree with a statistic or data or an article. It's a little bit harder when somebody's telling you their personal experience. That doesn't mean they won't reject it, absolutely, but it's a little bit harder, right? Step two, a lot of times the folks you're talking to will claim to be Christian. So use the Bible. Why? Because they won't read Stamped from the Beginning. That's woke CRT stuff. But if they claim to be believers, then ostensibly they think the Bible is important, right? But I am far from convinced that we as a church have done nearly enough to disciple people into what the Bible says about a foundational doctrine like the Imago Dei, which appears in the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, Genesis 26 through 28. So God created human beings in God's image and in God's likeness. But that's just the beginning, because Genesis 3:15 said the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. That is the proto-evangelion, the first gospel, which was not confined to a particular ethnicity or people group. But then you read throughout the Old Testament, it talks about the nations streaming to the mountain of the Lord. Then you get the fulfillment of that promise of the proto-evangelion in a person, Jesus Christ. who is the Prince of Peace, who says we've been given this ministry of reconciliation because we ourselves have been reconciled to God. Then the fulfillment where in Revelation, God pulls back the curtain of eternity and he says, this is what it's going to look like forever, which is people from every tribe, tongue, and nation gathered around the throne worshiping the Lamb, right? Walk them through the biblical story about oneness and unity. Then lastly, step 3. Then you go to the history. Why? Because history has the receipts. My most viral social media post was about Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech. Alexander Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy, and he said, our cornerstone as the Confederacy, in talking about the government of the Confederacy, is built on the idea that black people are inferior and white people are superior. He said this explicitly in a speech. Those kinds of things, again, they can still stiff arm it because this is an ideology, not a matter of data and facts. But it's still a little bit harder. These are the words of the historical actors themselves telling on themselves about what they were doing. And on the flip side, things like we just celebrated MLK Day. How many folks have gone back and read Letter from Birmingham Jail or read any of King's books beyond a quote? I'm so sick of the soundbite King. Let's get beyond the quotable King and move into his actual life. So, personal testimony, walking through Scripture and understanding what the real theology of equality is, and then hitting them with some facts. I'm biased. I like the historical facts, but I recommend that.
All right. Do you want to add something, Dr. Jones?
Yeah, I think we're closing. But all right, I think the beauty in all of this is that we have different, really, really smart, capable, and caring people who have different approaches to things, and we always have, and that's great, and it's needed. I want to let you all know, remind you, and I'm not a reverend, even though you said it.
It was a Freudian slip.
I know for you, but also Reverend Cosby and my grandmother, who tried to push me on the reverend thing for years. Then she died, and he picked up where she left off, telling me I should be a reverend, but I'm not. But I will say, too, in the tradition of King, I'm a graduate of Morehouse College, a proud Morehouse man. I am not interested in flights of fancy, pipe dreams, or spend the rest of whatever years I have left tilting at windmills. Stephan keeps coming back to this, what can we do to convince white people? I'll close as I opened. I do not think there is a strategy to convince white people en masse to help us. Now, when I say this, people say, you're a racist. I get called a racist in Kentucky like twice an hour. But I can't be a racist because I have white friends.
You got a racist bone in your body.
Wait. I have a black friend. Daniel Cameron's my friend. Oh, look,
what?
My thought, for me, practically, I really do believe that Charles Blow is on to something. You know, speaking as a black person and a political scientist, I think Blow is on to something. I think it is a practical move to make that we should plan out. And I'm not saying it will happen in my lifetime, but it's a move to make. And people go, you want all black people to do this? All black people are not going to go. There are some black people that are very happy in Wisconsin. There are some black people that are very happy in Utah. They're happy in Oregon. They're happy in North Dakota. They're happy in Kentucky. They're going to stay. Okay? They're going to stay. And that's okay. But for black people who really want to have lives, a sister sent me a disturbing text the other day. She's over at the University of Louisville. And I said, how you doing, sis? And she said, I'm surviving, but not thriving. I want to have a world where we can actually thrive. I want to have a world where we can be happy, at peace, not stressed, not having to deal with white supremacy every day. I want to have a world where a school system is not attacking our children's minds. That's all I want. I want to have a world where we don't have black people who skinning and grinning and happy as the day is long to work for the mayor. I want to have a world where black people can be the mayor. That ain't Louisville. That ain't Louisville.
Not yet.
It is not, and it will not be. Louisville made a very conscious decision 2 decades ago to merge the city and county. At that time, black people were right at 33 to 35% of the vote and tacking towards a point where you could elect a black mayor. Once they merged, they cut that voting strength in half. Now Louisville is one of only 2 of the 50 largest cities in the country to have never elected a black, Hispanic, or female mayor. Some people in this city want to escape the drudgery of Kentucky and Louisville to get up the road to Indianapolis. Guess what? Indianapolis is the other of those 2 cities. All right? So these are things that you need to, when Ida B. Wells Barnett was on, founder of the Memphis Free Speech, what the film didn't cover was when she wrote Lynch Law in all its phases, Ida B. Wells Barnett got to the point where she told black people in Memphis and in Tennessee, there may come a time when we can return to this place. But right now, we need to leave. And she left. We got to know when we've been beaten. My belief is we've been beaten in Kentucky. We haven't been beaten overall. We ain't got to stay here. We ain't got to stay in Texas, right? We don't have to stay in Maine or Vermont. There are places where our people are waiting for us to join with them in building lives where we and our children are free of daily white supremacy. That's all I'm saying. I'm thinking about it practically.
I just want to clarify too. Your key words in the first part of your statement were en masse, which I completely agree with. I agree with that because I look backwards at U.S. history, and there's never been a sustained, widespread coalescing of white people coming alongside black people for the long haul for radical change. But there are a few. And the question is, when you have a few, like you have here, how do you empower them to reach out in spaces where we aren't, and we don't want to be, and we probably never will be? And
They should come to Atlanta with us.
Yes, I agree.
We're going to take these white people with us.
And the reason why I say anything is because the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. That is to say, we have the keenest insight about what the issues are. So if you're willing to listen, here's what I got to say. Those 3 things. But that's about as far as I go. And the rest of my energy is spent at Simmons College, The Witness, a black Christian collective, writing the history and studying the history that will help bring the truth, which will set us free. But that's just a clarification I wanted to make in case I wasn't clear.
Okay, Dr. Whitaker, we'll
I was
let you
just
have the
gonna add,
last word.
Like real quick, like white pastors in white congregations. I'm a white pastor. We have work to do. We have work to do, and I'd love to go with you, but I got work to do here. I'll come visit for sure. But white people have work to do in white space, and we can't be afraid of that. And we can't be afraid to make other people uncomfortable. It's going to be fine. You may not get paid as much. You'll be fine, really, because you won't get paid as much. But there is work to be done in white space, and it's the role of white people to do that work.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But